صل على محمد وآل محمد. أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم. بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. الحمد لله رب العالمين، والصلاة والسلام على أشرف الأنبياء والمرسلين، سيدنا ونبينا وحبيب قلوبنا وشفيع لذنوبنا وطبيب نفوسنا أبي القاسم محمد. والصلاة والسلام على أهل بيته الطيبين الطاهرين المعصومين، ولعنة الله على أعدائهم أجمعين إلى قيام يوم الدين. وفقنا الله وإياكم بعلم وعمل صالح إن شاء الله، ببركة الصلاة على محمد وآل محمد. أما بعد، فقد قال الله الحكيم في كتابه الكريم: بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. فأقم وجهك للدين حنيفا فطرة الله التي فطر الناس عليها لا تبديل لخلق الله ذلك الدين القيم ولكن أكثر الناس لا يعلمون. آمنا بالله. صدق الله العلي العظيم. اللهم صل على محمد وآل محمد. أحسنتم. Respected elders, brothers and sisters, Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Having discussed what we discussed last night regarding the position of the aql, and how there are different attitudes towards the power of reasoning that is held by every single human being. And we spoke about the two paradigms or the two versions with respects to how the aql is approached and how it's examined. On the one school, or from on the one perspective, you find a school that says that the aql or the intellect or the power of the intellect is given absolute authority, and that has its ramifications. Whereas the religion of Islam, through the Quran, we realize that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala makes it clear that the aql is deficient. The aql is weak to a certain extent. It can understand certain ideas with regards to existence, but beyond that, it needs the aid of revelation to feed us more information of how to live our lives and how to lead our lives. One of the other weaknesses of the aql is that the human being idealistically should follow what he knows. And we mentioned this briefly yesterday, that if a person recognizes the truth, it becomes incumbent, it's mandated to follow the truth. That's an idealistic position, but it's not realistic. Realistically, you'll find many people who know what the truth is, but they will not follow it. Clear example is a person who is a lung surgeon. He may smoke and may engage in smoking cigars and so on and so forth. He knows that it's bad for him, yet his desires would kick in and would allow him to engage in certain acts that goes against his knowledge. He knows what the truth is, but he will not necessarily follow it. And you can come up with a spectrum of different examples to show this. It shows that the human being is not just a reasonable human being, is not just an intellectual being, but there are desires, there are imaginations, there are all sorts of different emotions that he plays along with that nurtures his actions or makes him act in certain ways. The human being by nature is not a machine. So when it comes to providing truth or showing people what the truth is, by necessity, it doesn't mean that the human being will interact with the truth with rationality. So for example, if you come across an atheist or anyone who does not follow the madhab of the Ahlul-bayt alayhim as-salam, and you sit them down and you explain to them that this is the truth according to Quran, according to the intellect, according to rationality, according to, for example, logic and common sense and so on and so forth, it doesn't necessitate that the person will accept it. Even though it is true and it makes sense to him, it doesn't mean that by necessity he will accept it. Because human beings are very complex in nature. When you look at, for example, some of the discussions that researchers are having today amongst the Muslim community, the broader Muslim community, not just within our madhab, but between the different madhahib, they ask a question. Why is it that people are leaving the religion of Islam? You see, this is a very interesting discussion. People are leaving the religion of Islam, but more non-Muslims are coming towards Islam. So in one of the videos, I remember one person said, those who leave the religion of Islam, leave. But remember, you're being replaced by people who are stronger because they have this interest of learning about Islam. And they become, or they develop an affinity towards the religion of Islam. They become stronger Muslims than you were ever. So, you have people leaving the religion of Islam. Why is it that people are leaving Islam? It's not because of rationality. It's not because of intellectual. They find that the religion of Islam is intellectually deficient. It's because of cultural reasons, for example. It's because of emotional reasons. How certain family members behaved with them when they were children. What happened to them. Maybe there was an incident that happened when they were young. And they blame Muslims. And hence they blame the religion of Islam. Later on, that has ramifications which turns out which allows them to leave the religion of Islam. So it's never an intellectual decision for them to leave the religion of Islam, but it's emotional or it's cultural or and other reasons. With regards to this understanding that the human being is not a machine where you just input rationality and expect the human being to follow it, to follow the truth, you find that because the human being is complex, here Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala presents a different discussion, a side discussion that allows the human being to understand that there are other ways of understanding the truth and not just rationality, not just depending on rationality, which is known as the fitrah. And this verse that I began with speaks about the dimension of the fitrah, which again is an unseen creation of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. We spoke about this yesterday. The paradigm that the Islamic worldview presents is that the human being is both physical as well as spiritual. Part of the formation of the human being and the creation of the human being is the establishment of the fitrah. So our discussion will take place in a number of different steps. Number one, what is the fitrah exactly? The fitrah it has many different terminologies. So for example, Muslim philosophers will use this as the primordial nature of man, the first principle. Or for example, a predisposition of the human being, the innate disposition of the human being. These are all different terms which collectively implies what the fitrah is. It's just that the religion of Islam has given this specific term. So when you understand what the fitrah is, it is the first principle. According to some Muslim philosophers, they use this term, the first principle. When something is considered to be a first principle, you don't need to prove it. You know, if someone was to ask the question, what is the proof that there is a fitrah of the human being? Well, you don't need the proof, you don't need evidences to show that the fitrah exists. Why? Because it's something that we all recognize. As human beings, by definition, we recognize that there is a fitrah within every single human being. And you'll understand when you look at the characteristics of the fitrah, you'll understand why you don't need evidences to claim that there is a fitrah. So, the fitrah essentially is a program that each and every single one of us has been endowed with. You know, when we speak about programs, I'll give you a very simple example. It's not a perfect example, but it's a similarity. It's something for you to just grasp an understanding as to what exactly the fitrah is. When you look at, for example, an operating system and a software, you have an operating system and you have different applications that is compatible with the operating system. You have softwares which is compatible with the operating system. Let's say, for example, as a developer, you have an operating system, Android. You want to develop an app for Android, you'll develop an app that is suitable for the operating system. If you develop an app based on a software that is not compatible with Android, it's not going to work. If you develop, for example, an application for Apple and expect it to work on Android, it's not going to work. Now, of course, there are loopholes. You can make it work, but by definition, it's not as easy as installing and downloading and installing the software. It just doesn't work. If you, for example, take a software that is specific for Apple and you try play it on Windows, it's not going to work. Why? Because the operating system and the software are different. They're not compatible. Now, the claim that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala makes within the specific verse, He says that not only has every single human being been endowed with the fitrah, but the religion of Islam is compatible with the fitrah that has been given to the human being. Meaning that if the human being develops a worldview, a paradigm, a system, a philosophy of how he lives his life, which is other than the religion of Islam, there is a level of incompatibility that takes place. It doesn't match. So if you, for example, live a lifestyle that does not correspond to the Islamic theology of Tawheed, Nabuwah, of the Day of Judgment, if you live a lifestyle that does not appreciate or does not correlate with the practicalities of what Islam demands from you, you're living a life that is incompatible. And sooner or later, you will see a deluge of problems that take place within your life. We live in a world where there is a heavy nuance to the accumulation of resources. This is one of the perceptions of perfection, isn't it? Perfection is when a person accumulates vast resources, vast wealth. It promotes this idea very, very clearly. But at the same time, we realize that people are unhappy. Well, if this is supposed to be the avenue and the pathway to happiness, why is it that people have everything that they ever wanted, yet still are unhappy? So, again, it comes back to this idea. When you have a fitrah that is programmed within you, and at the same time you develop a worldview or a lifestyle that is incompatible with your fitrah, then you will see problems take place within your life. The religion of Islam, the claim that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala makes is that the religion of Islam accommodates the fitrah, they go hand to hand. So, according to the scholars, according to the researchers, they say that as the fitrah was created, as it is a program that governs our innate predisposition, it holds certain characteristics. It has certain levels of knowledge. The knowledge that it has is that it recognizes that there is a higher power. It recognizes that there is a higher authority. We may not know what that authority is. This is where the aql comes in and tells you what exactly the higher authority is. But the fitrah recognizes that there is a higher authority. Now note what the verse says. فِطْرَةَ اللَّهِ الَّتِي فَطَرَ النَّاسَ. It says that every single human being has been given the fitrah. From the moment man came into existence until today, every single human being in between has been living according to their fitrah, or has the fitrah embedded within themselves. Every single human being recognizes that there is a higher authority or a higher power. You examine any civilization, you examine any culture, each and every single culture and civilization has always believed in a higher power. That energy has always existed. But the way that energy has been channeled has not been channeled in the best of ways. So for example, when you look at polytheism, when you look at, for example, Greek mythology, Norse mythology, Hinduism is a very old religion. It predates some of the Abrahamic religion. It predates Christianity. It predates Judaism. Polytheism has always existed. What's the nuance? What's the root of polytheism? Polytheism is when the human being recognizes that there is a higher power, but then they would form idols and worship idols to try and cultivate and nurture that feeling of worshipping a higher power. That's what polytheism is. In fact, the initiation of polytheism began in the time of Nabi Nuh alayhi salam. That's why in the first khutbah of Nahj al-Balagha, Amir al-Mu'mineen alayhi salatu wassalam makes a very, very powerful statement. He says that Allah has sent down Anbiya, Allah has sent down Rusul, messengers and prophets to guide and nurture mankind to channel that feeling of worshipping a higher power towards Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Prophets, 124,000 prophets, they came one after another, they were sent to different nations. They saw that people had this energy of worship, but they were worshipping the wrong things. So their responsibility was to then nudge the human being towards the path of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. That was the responsibility of the prophets. It reminds us of the beautiful hadith of the Holy Prophet of Islam. And this hadith is also reverberated and repeated by the Ahlul-bayt alayhim salam, where they say, كُلُّ مَوْلُودٍ يُولَدُ عَلَى فِطْرَتِهِ, that every single child that is born according to their fitrah. But then later on, what happens? The later on what happens is that the parents would then convert the child to become a Christian or a Jew. But more broader than that, what the meaning or the implication of this particular hadith is that the external environment of the child pushes him away from ad-dinul hanif, the upright religion, the religion of Islam. What's even more remarkable is that modern day science and research within the fields of academia have solidified this particular hadith of the Holy Prophet and the Ahlul-bayt alayhim salam. When you turn to the world of academia, for example, they have a number of researchers have published a number of papers that specify that children from a very, very young age recognize that there is a higher power. And that higher power is none other than Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Justin Barrett, for example, Professor Justin Barrett, a researcher and a professor of Oxford University, speaks about this. He says that children from a very young age recognize that there is a higher authority. Even if the parents are hardcore atheists, the child still believes that there is a higher power, that there is a God. He says that not only that, but when children were asked what exactly are the specifications and characteristics of this God, they said that God is all powerful, that God is all knowing, all wise, immortal. God has all of the attributes that usually you and I study in theology. So this was his research that he developed and he published. You find, for example, a second person, Deborah Kellerman. Deborah Kellerman, she was a professor of psychology. She writes, she says that children are born intuitive theists. That's very interesting. That's a remarkable statement to make. The implication of what she said, that children are intuitive theists, she says that children, when they are raised, when they are very, very young, and as they are being raised, they recognize that by observing the creation, by observing the things around them, they come to the rational conclusion that none of it could exist except for, if it was not for Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. She says that one of the ways of understanding this is by looking how the universe, or looking how the world, looking at or observing how the world works. You see, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has created this world, has created this universe, which is deeply connected with human intuition. Naturally, there are certain things that we know through intuition. No one needs to teach us. One of that, or one of which, is the principle of causality, causation. For every cause, there is an effect. An effect never exists without a cause. Whatever it may be, every effect behind it, there is a cause. Now, when children are asked, and you'll find this quite predominant amongst children. For those of you who have children, you'll know that your discussions sometimes can become very, very heavy. If it begins to rain, the child will ask, well, why is it raining? Say, because the clouds are storing the water. It's like, how did the water get into the clouds? Well, because it evaporated from the seas. Well, how did it evaporate from the seas? It goes on and on and on. And the question why can go endlessly. Children have this curiosity, so they ask questions. By observing the world around them, they recognize that at some point, you have to come to a first cause, and that is Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So this was her research, which was a very interesting research. You have a third professor, a researcher, Petrovich, from the University of Oxford. This is a very interesting research. She interviewed, or she observed the behavior of children from the ages of 4 to 7 within the Japanese Shinto culture and British children as well. In her conclusion, she said that part of the research, what we did was we showed pictures of man-made objects and natural objects to the children. So whenever man-made objects were shown, we asked the question, who created this? And they would say that human beings created it, whoever created it. But when we showed pictures of flowers and mountains and so on and so forth, the children collectively, unanimously would say that this was created by God, a higher power. This is not something that the human being made. This is something that was created by a higher power, something that is beyond the capacity of human beings. Not only that, she says that what's remarkable is that within the Japanese Shinto culture, they don't believe in God. So how is it that their children believe in God? It comes back down to what the Holy Prophet of Islam said, كُلُّ مَوْلُودٍ يُولَدُ عَلَى فِطْرَةٍ, that children from a very young age recognize that there is a higher power. But that has to be nurtured, that has to be sustained by the environment that they are raised up in. Otherwise, the external environment will push them away from their fitrah. When you turn to Karbala, the movement of Karbala, the children of Abi Abdullah alayhi salam, the children of the Ahlul-bayt played a phenomenal role in preserving the religion of Islam, the message of the Imam alayhi salam. That's remarkable at a different level altogether. Why? Children recognize that there is a presence of the Almighty, that there is a higher authority. But the children of Karbala, they were willing to give their lives to preserve the message of the Almighty. They took it to the next level, where they were willing to now sacrifice their lives. These are children we're talking about. Ali, for example, Qasim, you have Aun and Muhammad and so on and so forth. Majority of them were willing to give their lives to preserve the message of Abi Abdullah alayhi salam. The second area of the discussion with regards to the verse, having understood that there is something known as the fitrah, which is a program that we have been created with, that nurtures us to recognize a higher power who is Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, how does this fitrah manifest itself in our actions? The human being has certain deep inclinations towards certain things or certain areas. These deep inclinations manifest as actions. Now here, the ulama asked the question. In order to answer this question, they said, how can you categorize the actions of a human being? We're not talking about actions which are performed consciously. There are certain actions that we perform subconsciously without us realizing. And there are four in number. The first is when we perform actions which are considered to be habits. If someone is habituated to a particular action, he may not even realize that he's doing it, but he's performing the action. It could be, for example, the time of the day you wake up, what you do as soon as you wake up. For example, going walking, doing fidgeting, for example. These are all habits that we develop. Sometimes we develop good habits, sometimes we develop bad habits. You know, some of the ulama of akhlaq, they say that if you've habituated yourself to sin, try and reverse it by habituating yourself to abstain from that particular sin. The power of habits is a very phenomenal, it's a remarkable habit, concept in itself, because it allows you to develop either good or bad habits. But that's obviously a different discussion. So habits is an act where a person performs something without acknowledging it. Is that what the fitrah is? No, not necessarily. The fitrah, according to the second act, is when a person does something which is natural, tabi'i, as it's known in the Arabic language, something which is considered to be natural. The idea behind this is that if we, all of us, were placed in a specific situation or a specific circumstance, we would all naturally perform the same action. As an example, if a person, it's a very simple example, if a person has been placed in a dark tunnel, pitch black, he cannot see a single thing, but then he sees a ray of light coming from afar, naturally the human being will move towards the light. True or no? This is what each and every single one of us will do. We see ourselves being trapped, we see a way out, so we follow that beam of light so that we're able to come out. Is this what the fitrah is? Not necessarily. The third action or the third category of actions that we perform subconsciously is based on our desires. The stem of that action is based on our desires. So as human beings, we have the desires to do certain things. The desire, for example, to procreate, the desire to have a relationship, the desire to settle down, the desire to have children. All of this Quranically, when you look at the story of Nabi Zakaria in his old age, he turns to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and he says, Ya Allah, grant me a child. Grant me a child who will inherit after me. I've accumulated all of this wealth. I don't want my family members to take this wealth away from me after I leave this world and to squander it and to abuse it and to misuse it. He says, I'd rather have a child who inherits from me, يَرِثُنِي وَيَرِثُ مِنْ آلِ يَعْقُوبَ, who inherits from the family of Yaqub. So, according to some scholars, they say that By desire, the way we have been programmed, we wish to leave behind a lineage, to have children. This is part of the innate desire of the human being. But is this what is considered to be fitrah? Scholars say no, not necessarily. The reason being is because even animals have this desire. Animals share certain desires that human beings have as well. When you refer back to the holy verse of the Quran, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, فَطَرَ النَّاسَ عَلَيْهَا. This is specific to human beings. The fitrah is specific to the human beings, not something that the animals have. So desires is not the answer. The fourth category is that fitrah is a deep inclination to certain concepts, certain aspects that we wish to materialize within our lives. If the human being was to go through the processes of self-introspection, look within oneself deeply, he will see that he has this yearning and this desire towards certain things. For example, the desire towards truth. Every single human being is inclined to speak the truth. Why do people tell lies? Why do people engage in lies? Because they see that there is a benefit in engaging in a lie. If there is no benefit for a person to lie, then the person will not lie. If a person is given a choice, given $10 by saying the truth, or $10 by saying the lie, or by speaking the lie, naturally the human being fitratan will tell the truth. Why? Because there is no added benefit for him to tell the lie. So naturally the human being is more accustomed towards truth. Or for example, when it comes to dignity, every single human being wishes to be dignified. Inna izzata lillah. Dignity comes from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. When you look at Imam al-Sajjad alayhi salam, Allahumma salli ala Muhammad wa ala Muhammad. The holy Imam was asked, you've experienced Karbala. You've experienced, for example, what happened after Karbala. What was the hardest part? What was the most trying and the most difficult in this whole event and this whole saga of Karbala? What does he reply with? He says, Asham, Asham, Asham. They asked him why. He says, because when we were in chains, shackled, in the presence of Yazid ibn Muawiyah, they were laughing at us. We were humiliated. So the nature, this innate desire, he said, our enemies were joyous that they had captivated us, that they had imprisoned us. So this desire of having dignity is something that we all share as human beings. Or for example, freedom, to be free, to be liberated. This is an innate desire. This is part of the fitrah, to have knowledge. Again, to acquire knowledge, knowledge acquisition, wisdom acquisition. This is something that we all share. We see this as something good and we accustom ourselves to it. When you come across a person who is a jahil, a person who is absolutely ignorant, even if you call him an ignorant person, he'll feel hurt. He'll feel insulted, even if he lacks knowledge. Reason being is because naturally the human being is more inclined towards gaining and towards the acquisition of knowledge. Immortality is one of this. Naturally the human being wishes to live on. If a person is healthy, if a person has no ailments, for example, life is good, death is not even part of his thought. His thinking processes don't even involve death or dying. Every single human being wishes to live their lives as long as they can. When it comes to our du'as, for example, we speak to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, we pray to Him for a long life. None of us pray and wish for death. When you look at, for example, Sallu ala Muhammad wa ala Muhammad. The idea of immortality, because it's fitratan, because it's fitratan, Allah accommodates for it. But Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says that if you have this desire to live for eternity, that won't take place in dunya, it will manifest itself where? In akhirah. In akhirah, this fitrah will be accommodated for. This desire of immortality will be accommodated for. When you examine previous cultures and civilizations, for example, the Egyptians during the time of the pharaohs, if you look at history and how they used to bury their kings and so on and so forth, the belief in the hereafter was embedded within their culture. What they believed in was not correct. It wasn't in line with what the religion of Islam is teaching. But nonetheless, they used to believe in the hereafter, and they would bury their deads according to their own tribes and their own cultures and teachings and religious values. So you find that this idea of the hereafter, of living, of there being a different life, where the human being will live for eternity, has always existed in the minds of people, manifested in different ways, but the essence of that belief has always been there. These ideas, truth, freedom, liberation, immortality, to have a long life, all of these different things is not something that needs to be taught to us. This is something that we figure out ourselves. It's something that is deeply part and parcel of one's existence. It's not something that we need to sit down with a teacher for them to teach you that you as a human being, you need to accustom yourself towards truth and so on and so forth. No, this is something that we develop amongst ourselves. Justice is one of them as well. Every single human being understands the value of justice. If you look at despots and tyrants, regardless of how or what type of crimes they commit and how they subjugate their own people, once they come into public, they demonstrate themselves as good leaders. They show the media that they are good leaders, that they are strong leaders, that they are the representative of their people. Behind closed doors, they could be massacring their own people. But as long as they are in public and when the camera's on, they display a different persona altogether. So you find that fitratan, we have all of these different attributes and all of these different traits. The ayah continues, لا تبديل لخلق الله. Allah is now making a very interesting claim here. As I mentioned before, there shall not be a change in what Allah has created. It comes back to what we mentioned earlier. When Allah has given the human being the fitrah and He has developed the religion of Islam, they both go hand in hand. If there is a change in this pattern or in this system that Allah has created, then the human being will face certain trials and difficulties within their lives. The fitrah, by understanding what the fitrah is and what the role of the fitrah is, the external environment can either weaken the fitrah or can strengthen the fitrah. In other words, what Allah is explaining to us in this verse is that if a person, according to their fitrah, follows Islam, follows the guidelines of the religion of Islam, it will strengthen the fitrah. But as long as they move away from Islam, or when they move away from Islam, then naturally the fitrah will become weakened. Observe it from this perspective, the mind of the human being. There are two types of minds that we have, the conscious and the subconscious. The conscious mind plays a role, and the subconscious mind plays a role as well. The conscious mind is when I observe my environment, my surroundings, I process the information, and I make judgments or I understand what's going on. So if a person is speaking, your mind will automatically try and understand who is speaking, what is he saying, what's the body language that he's using. This is all conscious. A person walking, when you observe a person walking, then you say to yourself, well, where is he walking to? What direction is he walking? How fast is he walking? This is all conscious. The subconscious mind is a memory that is stored within the mind that has been locked away. It's been clouded. If you observe children, for example, let's say, for example, a person who is young, a child, goes through a tough patch in his life. Something happens, something nasty happens in his life. Because of that experience, he doesn't wish to remember, he doesn't want to remember it, so he will forget it. And the mind is very good in doing this. If something traumatic takes place in one's life, the mind will cover up that experience, lock it away so that you never remember it again. But what happens is that traumatic experience manifests itself physically in your actions. So although years later, when you mature, you're not able to remember what initially happened when you were a child, it manifests in how you interact with the people around you. It manifests in your actions. Communication sometimes becomes harder until you have the ability to go back, understand what happened, and try and rectify it and move on in the best way possible. I'll give you another example. A child. We were all children once upon a time. When a child plays, he develops certain affinities to certain things. He develops aspirations, he develops goals. And the goals of a child are very different to the aspirations of an adult. If you ask a child, what is it that you want to be when you grow up? It's a builder, or for example, a fireman, or for example, a teacher, a nurse, whatever it is, a musician, an artist, whatever it may be. As the child matures, if the child still has this inclination, then the parents will sit the child down and say, look, maybe being an artist is not the best idea. There's no way of you earning an income or supporting a family through being an artist. If you pursue this, maybe perhaps things will not turn out the way you expect it to be. So naturally, the environment that the child is raised in pushes him away from following his desires or his aspirations. So as he matures, many years later, he forgets what his aspirations were 40 years prior. He doesn't remember. He can't remember. He turns out to be a lawyer. He turns out to be a doctor, a dentist, whatever it may be. But because that memory is locked away in the unconscious or the subconscious mind, doesn't mean that he's abandoned it altogether. That subconscious entity that has been locked away has an effect on his actions, and he may not even realize it. It's the same principle when it comes to the religion of Islam. Within the religion of Islam, if a person actively follows the tenets of Islam and the principles and the disciplines that Islam demands, it nurtures the fitrah, it strengthens the fitrah. If the human being moves away from the religion of Islam, then it affects his actions, it affects his emotional health, it affects his psychological health, and most definitely his spiritual health, even if he doesn't recognize it. There is a spiritual paradigm that is taking place. It affects him on a spiritual level, even if he is not cognizant about it. When does the fitrah awaken? There are very few circumstances that a person goes through in their lives for them to experience the fitrah, the awakening and the revival of the fitrah. One of them is a near-death experience. And the Quran is very clear with regards to this. When a person is on the verge of death, he will call out to Allah. The aql, it's as if the aql goes on a vacation, on a holiday, the fitrah overpowers. When the fitrah overpowers, that's when the innate disposition of the human being manifests itself. When there's turbulence, when you're in sea, for example, and the waves are smashing against the ship and so on and so forth, that's when the fitrah calls out to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Then the ayah of the Quran makes it clear that when this human being is now in land, when he is safe, the external environment subdues the fitrah. It makes it dormant. It clouds it again. So, near-death experiences is one of these examples where the fitrah awakens. Sometimes it doesn't have to be a near-death experience. It could be any experience in life. A spiritual experience, a personal experience, whatever it may be. The fitrah overpowers momentarily, but then it's the environment that subdues it. Harun al-Rashid, his son Amin, narrates this. Amin was the brother of Ma'mun. He said that once we went for Hajj. And when we went for Hajj, my father, as every time he would travel, he would take an entire entourage with him. He said in the city of Medina or Mecca, or one of the outskirts of the cities, he said we pitched our tents. And my father's tent, obviously the glamour that's associated with it, there were gates that surrounded the tent. Soldiers were there, security was at its fullest. He said the noblemen were within the tent. My father was sitting on the throne. He was talking away to his noble friends and so on and so forth. All of a sudden, one of the guards walks in. One of the security walks in. He says, Ya Amir al-Mu'mineen, Musa ibn Jaffer al-Sadiq alayhi salam is at the gate. He said, what I saw was extraordinary. My father stopped talking to everyone. He got up from his throne. He says, my father never gets up from his throne. People come to him. But this time I saw him come up or get up from his throne and he went outside. And he greeted the Imam alayhi salam. He opened the gates for the Imam alayhi salam. He said, Baba, we've got servants for this. My father never does this for anyone. He went, he opened the gates. He guided the camel in. He said what was interesting is that Imam Musa alayhi salam never got off from his camel. people usually, they get off, they show respect. When you meet a president or a king, whoever it may be, a person of great authority, there's a way of approaching them. And there is a style of dress that you have to engage in before even approaching them. He said the Imam alayhi salam never even got off from his camel. He guides the camel in. The Imam then dismounts from the camel. Then they go into the tent. The noblemen are all observing. He comes and he sits on his throne. My father sits on his throne. And he makes sure that the Imam alayhi salam sits alongside him. Then he engages in a discussion with Imam alayhi salam. He ignores all of the noblemen and the aristocrats that are there present. He said when that finishes, the Imam gets up and he leaves. When the Imam leaves, my father follows him and escorts him out of the tent. And then he sees him off. He said when all the people left, I came to my father and I asked him, I said, Dad, what did you do? He said, this is a person. He's not even part of your inner circle. But the level of respect that you showed him and veneration is something that I've never experienced before. So he said, my son, let me explain something to you. This person who came, huwa khalifat al-haq, wa ana khalifat al-dunya. He said, he is the vicegerent of truth and I am the representative of dunya. He's the rep of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and I'm the rep of the dunya. He said, when I heard my father saying this, and I said to him, well, if that's the case and you admit yourself that he is the rep of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, why don't you give him the khilafah? Isn't it right to give him the khilafah, especially if you don't see yourself befitting for it? He said, my son, if you were to grow up and dispute or have a dispute with me with regards to this seat, I would not hesitate to kill you. So again, momentarily he sees the truth, the fitrah comes out, the fitrah speaks on his behalf, on behalf of the aql, but then the ego steps in, but then the love of the world steps in, and it overpowers the fitrah. Whereas, and in turn, the effect of which is that the fitrah becomes dormant, it subdues itself. In Karbala, we see another episode, Umar ibn Sa'ad. He goes through the same processes. Ibn Ziyad approaches Umar ibn Sa'ad, he says to him, I will give you the kingdom of Ray. All you have to do in return is to slaughter Abi Abdullah alayhi salam. The question arises, when people see the truth momentarily, isn't it sufficient for them to turn towards the truth and to follow it? In the case of Umar ibn Sa'ad, in the case of Harun, and so on and so forth, there are plenty of different examples. Isn't it sufficient for a person to recognize that this is the truth, and once a person recognizes the truth, it is incumbent for them to follow it? Well, truth and hidayah, following the truth, is only when a person wishes to follow the truth. It all depends on the intention. You can come across a person who does not even care about the truth. If you give him proofs and evidences, as the Quran says, they see with their eyes, but they cannot see. Even if you show him what the reality is, he will not see it. They will hear the truth, but they will not hear it. They will interact with it, but they will not understand it. It's as if there is a lock within their hearts. He says to him, Ya Umar, all you have to do is slaughter Abi Abdullah alayhi salam, and the government of Ray is in your hands. Then Umar ibn Sa'ad engages in self-reflection. He says, well, on the one hand, he is the son of Zahra, the son of Ali alayhim salam. He says, on the one hand, he comes from the noble lineage of prophethood, but on the other hand, there is that governorship. There is that authority and there is that power. He tries to reconcile the two. He says, okay, I'll go ahead and I'll kill him, but then I'll also engage in istighfar. That was his reconciliation. On the 10th of Muharram, the first to engage in battle was Umar ibn Sa'ad. The reports tell us that as he was performing some of the heinous crimes on the 10th of Muharram, tears were flowing from his eyes. This is the fitrah calling out, shouting at this person, what are you doing? Yet at the same time, the love for the world overpowered that fitrah, and he went ahead and continued to commit the crimes that he committed. Without remorse, without any sorrow or any regret whatsoever. They say Abi Abdullah alayhi salam, as he enters the city of Karbala, the lands of Karbala, he stops and he turns to his companions and he says to them, what land is this? There is a name given for this specific land. What is the name? They said to him, Ya Aba Abdullah, one of the names of this land is An-Nainawa. He says, no, there is a different name. He says, Al-Ghadiriyya. He says, no. He says, Al-Ha'ir. No. He says, this is the land known as Karb wa Bala. Then the Imam stops. He then turns to Allah and he says, Allahumma inna na'udhu bika min karbin wa bala. Ya Allah, we seek refuge from you, or we seek refuge in you from the distress and calamities and difficulties. Then he turns to his companions and he says, Ha huna mahattu rihaluna, Ha huna tudhbahu rijaluna, Ha huna tusbahu nisa'una. He says, this is the place where we will stop and dismount. This is the end of our journey. This is the place where our men will be slaughtered. This is the place where our women will be taken as prisoners. He turns to Abu Fadl al-Abbas. Ya Abbas, Ya Akhi Abbas, pitch the tents of the Bani Hashim. Abu Fadl al-Abbas paints the tents of the Bani Hashim, especially the tents of the women. Thereupon he goes towards Zainab alayhi salam. He helps her dismount from the horse and guides her towards her tent. Such respect and dignity was shown towards Zainab alayhi salam. Aliyun al-Akbar helps his mother dismount from the camel and guides her towards her tent. Qasim helps his mother dismount from the camel and guides her towards the tent. On the 11th of Muharram, how that changed significantly. On the 11th of Muharram, when the women and children were leaving Karbala, Zainab turns towards the Furat, speaking with Abu Fadl al-Abbas. She says, يا أبا الفضل يا أبا الفضل أنت الذي أركبتني إذ أردت الخروج من المدينة. When we left the city of Medina, it was you who helped me mount and dismount from my camel. You helped me along the travels. يا أبا الفضل. Now look what's happened. We are surrounded by our enemies, and every time I cry and weep and lament, they beat me, Ya Aba al-Fadl. On the 10th of Muharram, Hamid ibn Muslim narrates, he says, I saw a young girl frantically running from one place to another. They came and they burned the tents. This child was running from one place to another, so my heart broke. I approached her. I wished to help her. When she saw me, she got scared and she said to me, Ya Shaykh, do you not read the Quran? Allah says in the Quran, فَأَمَّا الْيَتِيمَ وَلَا تَقْهَرْ وَأَمَّا السَّائِلَ فَلَا تَنْهَرْ. And as for the orphan, do not hurt them, do not attack them. And as for the one who has needs, do not turn them away. He says, yes, I've read this verse. She replies, she says, أنا اليتيم أبي عبد الله. I am the orphan of my father, Abi Abdullah alayhi salam. He says to her, how can I help you? She says to him, Ya Sheikh, take me to the lands of Najaf. He's baffled. Why the lands of Najaf? What's in Najaf, little girl? What's in Najaf? She says, I have heard my Aunt Zainab say that there is a grave in Najaf, that we have a grave in Najaf. Whosoever approaches this grave in the state of distress, in the state of anguish, they would see a response come towards him. I wish to go towards the grave and complain to him what they did to my father on the 10th of Muharram, what they did to my aunt and what they did to my sisters. He says that Najaf is very far. I cannot take you to Najaf. Where can I take you? She says, take me towards the river Furat. He says, I thought she was thirsty, so I helped her go towards the Furat. But when she came closer towards the river, she saw her uncle Abu Fadl al-Abbas. She collapses on top of him. Oh, my uncle, Ya Abbas, Ya Abbas, stand and rise. Look what they did to us when you left us. إنا لله وإنا إليه راجعون سيعلم الذين ظلموا أي منقلب ينقلبون وآخر دعوانا عن الحمد لله رب العالمين. يا حسين.